We're back. I'm Kathryn Zox, your social worker with a microphone, and you are listening to the Social Workers Radio Talk Show on WCDB-FM at the University at Albany. And joining me this morning is Daniel H. Pink. Daniel Pink is the author of To Sell is Human, The Surprising Truth About Moving Others. He's the author of 4 books, New York Times bestselling author that have been translated into 33 languages. You can see him on the TED Talks. And he lives in Washington, D.C. with his family. Welcome to the show. Nice to have you on this morning, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I have to tell you, it's great. And we're here at the university, so there are a lot of students here waiting to hear what you have to say. I have a son who graduated from Wharton. He's waiting to see what you have to say, too. It's really exciting. Read your book. I just want to give a little intro. You say that it's not a secret that millions of Americans, 1 in 9 of us, in fact, work in traditional sales. The startling news is that in today's world, so do the other 8. Whether we're entrepreneurs, persuading funders, employing, pitching colleagues, or parents and teachers cajoling kids, we spend our days trying to move others. So in your book, you explain in the book To Sell is Human, The Surprising Truth About Moving Others. Like it or not, we're all in sales now. So I'm assuming that your book, obviously, is not just for business people, it's for all of us. So because we're all in the sort of, I guess, in the realm of trying to move people either to accept our ideas, we're always trying to move people to get them to do something, but not necessarily for money. All right, I've said enough now. So why do we need to read your book?
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. I mean, we're all in sales now, and if you just let's take a look at this just analytically. 1 in 9 Americans in the workforce work in sales. That is, their job is to get other people to buy stuff. So they're selling Winnebagos, they're selling pies, they're selling complex computer systems to companies. So 15 million Americans earn their living trying to get other people to buy something. But I think what's more curious and goes directly to what you were saying, Kathryn, is that if you look at those other 8 in 9, they're in sales too. That is, they're spending an enormous portion of their time and effort on the job convincing, persuading, cajoling people. They are bosses trying to get employees to do things a little bit differently. They are employees trying to get their boss to give them more resources so they can do their work better. They are people saying to their teammates, hey, let's do our project this way rather than that way. They are people pitching ideas in meetings. And done some research showing that people are spending about 40% of their time on the job in this thing that I call non-sales selling, where you're persuading, influencing, convincing people, trying to get them to make an exchange, but no money's changing hands, the cash register's not ringing, and the exchange is denominated not in dollars, but in time, effort, attention, energy, commitment, and so on. And so, like it or not, we're all in sales now.
All right, so we're all in sales now, and as you say in your book, but selling is very different now. It's not the selling, even though we may be selling different things than than the used car salesman was selling in the 20th century. We're in the 21st century, and how we sell is very different than how we sold in the 20th century. There are big changes. And so what is the difference?
Well, the big difference, and it's a huge difference, and I'm glad you pointed out, is difference in information. Most of what we know about sales comes from a world of information asymmetry, where the seller always had more information than the buyer. When the seller has more information than the buyer, in some cases a lot more information than the buyer, the seller can rip you off. The seller can take the low road, especially if buyers don't have a lot of choices and don't have a way to talk back. And so this is why we have the principle of buyer beware. When sellers know a huge amount more than buyers, buyers have to beware. It's also a reason why we think of sales, many of us think of sales as sleazy, slimy, smarmy, lowbrow, dishonest, deceitful, manipulative. That's because sellers always had an information advantage and buyers had to beware. Well, a funny thing has happened. In the last 10 years, that information asymmetry that defined the sales relationship is disappearing, right? You now have something closer to information parity. the best way to describe it, or one great example of it, is cars. 20 years ago, you walk into a Chevy dealer. That Chevy dealer is going to know a lot more about cars, a lot more about Chevys than you ever can.
Yeah, and
Today,
and Daniel,
not so much.
Well, it was a man's world. I mean, I don't care about cars. I never did. But when I go to buy a car, it doesn't matter whether I care about them or I have an interest. I just go online, as you say, get all the information, and when I go in to buy a car, I know what I'm talking about. So, I mean, that's a great example. I think another good example, because this is as a social worker, and it just happens to be my interest, is healthcare. And you talk about med ed, and we also, we are buying healthcare. So can we talk about that a little bit too, and how this principle applies?
Sure. Go into a doctor's office. I mean, talk to any doctor. What they'll tell you is, again, 20 years ago, if you had some kind of pain in your elbow, and you went into the doctor to describe to him or her your pain in the elbow, your doctor would say, all right, here's what I think is going on, here's what you should do. Now, you don't go to the doctor first, you go online first. You Google elbow pain or something like that, or elbow pain in 48-year-old men, and that you go online and you get some kind of information. And doctor after doctor after doctor has told me they have patients coming in with printouts from the internet, and the information advantage that doctors have is no longer the same. And what that means is that when buyers have as much information as sellers, the seller has to be aware. You can't be underhanded. You can't just roll over people. You can't do a bulldozer approach. What you have to do is you have to draw on some fundamentally different kinds of capabilities, what I think are far more human capabilities, the ability to be attuned to someone else, to understand their point of view, the ability to stay buoyant in the face of rejection, and also the ability to be super clear, to take this welter of information and detect the meaningful patterns, make it clear to people. And so it used to be that in the world of selling that we had to abide by the ABCs, A always, B, C closing, always be closing, always be closing. Now the new ABCs are attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. A, attunement, B, buoyancy, C, clarity. That's what it takes to move people effectively and ethically, whether you're a social worker, whether you're a physician, or whether you're a car salesman.
And also, that information is in real time. I mean, it's right now. It's not information that, you did research on 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. I think that makes a difference as well. And so who's the most up to date on their information also is going to make a difference. The other thing is, I was just thinking when you're talking about, you have to be flexible. You have to, you have all this information. When you go in, for instance, and you are applying for a job, you know as much about the person who is sitting there in the company that you're applying for the job as the guy knows or the gal knows about you, and because you also have all that information available, and that changes everything in terms of like trying to get a job.
It sure does. It forces both sides of the transaction to be much more honest and much more transparent. If the person interviewing me can go online and find out a lot about me, I can't say, oh, I won the Heisman Trophy when I was in college,
because he knows you didn't.
Quickly. At the same time,
Yeah.
you can as a job interviewee go into an interview and say, okay, do some research on the person interviewing you and say, what if we went to, what's some common ground that we have? Oh, wow, this guy went to SUNY Albany, so did I. There's some common ground. You can find out a lot more about what the company does and how you can help that company. And so what it requires is, again, not the skills of slipperiness and manipulation, but the skills of understanding where people are coming from, taking their perspective, distilling the information into something usable, and being as good at identifying new problems as you are at solving existing ones.
So you're saying one of the premises in your book is that salesmen are not born, but they're made. So if you have all the information and you get your book, that you too can learn how to sell yourself, sell an idea, sell whatever you're selling. Is that what you're saying?
Sure. I agree. I mean, I talked to a lot of salespeople for this book, and I think that this idea that that there's some people who are natural salespeople and other people who are not is just flatly wrong. I think at some level we're all natural salespeople. One of the most interesting findings is some research out of Wharton, where a guy named Adam Grant, a young scholar there, did some fascinating research that exploded the myth that you have to be very extroverted to be effective in sales. He did this really interesting piece of research where he measured the introversion-extroversion levels of a sales force, and he ended up identifying them on a 1 to 7 spectrum, 1 being extremely introverted, 7 being extremely extroverted. And then he watched how much these salespeople at the software company actually sold over the next 3 months. And what he found was that the very strong extroverts, they weren't very good at sales. They were scarcely better than the very strong introverts, the people who are cowering in the corner and can't pick up the phone. And that the stereotype we have of the gregarious, smiling, backslapping, elbow squeezing, hey, buddy, what can I do to put you in a Buick this afternoon kind of person, was not very good at sales. And the people who were really good at sales weren't the people, if we go back to our 1 to 7 spectrum here for a moment, 1 being extremely introverted, 7 being extremely extroverted. The people who were really good at it were the 3s, 4s, and 5s, the people in the middle.
And those you call the ambiverts?
Yeah, well, it's what social psychologists have been calling ambiverts, right? People in the middle. Why? They know when to speak up. They know when to shut up. They know when to push. They know when to hold back. The strong introverts aren't loud enough, don't assert. The strong extroverts never shut up, and they listen. They're terrible listeners. But it's the people in the middle who are much more calibrated, much more attuned to other people who do it very well. And I think the good news here for us, going back to your question about, is this something that's natural, is that most of us are ambiverts. Most of us are not super strong introverts. Most of us are not super strong extroverts.
But Daniel,
a little of both.
What about what is that situational? Because you're talking about most of us are somewhere in the middle. But does it depend on the situation? I know for myself, I can be in certain situations where I am an extrovert because I feel comfortable for a lot of different reasons, and then I can find myself in other situations where I would be the introvert, although I tend to go more to the extrovert side. Like when the different selling situations may kind of bring out the introvert or the extrovert or the ambivert in different people. Is that true?
Totally, but ambiverts are better at doing that. Ambiverts have more of have a broader repertoire. So it sounds to me like on a 1 to 7 spectrum, you might be, say, a 5 or 5.5. Well, what you can do, depending on the situation, is you can go down a notch to a 4. That's really the best number to be at. Or you can go up a little bit, depending on the contact. Where people have trouble is if they're at one side of the spectrum, where they don't have a strong extrovert, doesn't have any of the skills of an introvert in his or her repertoire. A strong introvert doesn't have any of the skills of an extrovert in his or her repertoire. But the people in the middle can do precisely as you say, depending on the context, depending on the situation, calibrate how they react.
What about, and I'm thinking about this because this is like kind of in the forefront of what we're trying to sell people today, given the economy. What about fundraising? I mean, I often, let's talk about it in the context of fundraising, because here's an example for me personally. Whoever they are, whatever the organization is, something maybe I belong to or I sit on a board, they want me to do fundraising. That's one thing I do not do well at all. I don't have those skills. And so what does it take to be a good fundraiser?
Well, when you say you don't have those skills, tell me about that. Or what is it about it that you don't like?
I don't like asking people for money. I feel more comfortable donating my money rather than asking people for money. Makes me feel very uncomfortable, and maybe because I personalize it. And when they're training you to raise funds, they're always, you're not asking for money for yourself, you're asking for the organization. Doesn't seem to work.
Interesting. Well, it's curious is that I think that there are all kinds of things that you can do here. One of them is the principle of attunement, is seeing the world through the other person's perspective. So just think about this. You just said you're not uncomfortable donating money. So maybe the people you're asking for money feel the same way, that they're not uncomfortable being asked for money, so why should you be uncomfortable asking them for money? So I think that's an important part. So if you understand the world from their perspective, saying there are a lot of people some people at least, who might be totally willing to be asked. have no problem being asked for money. And actually, some of them, and I found in nonprofits, some people have kind of been waiting around to be asked. So if you get out of your own head and see it from their perspective, that can make it a little bit easier. The other thing that comes out very clearly is one reason why people don't like asking for money in fundraising is nobody likes being rejected. And there's some really interesting research, actually, once again, out of the University of Pennsylvania, showing that the best predictor of sales success isn't subject matter expertise, but is what this one scholar, Martin Seligman, calls people's explanatory style. So it's how you explain failure that often predicts how good you are at this. And the way to explain failure is to depersonalize it. So if you ask somebody for money and they say no, it isn't because they don't like you. It isn't because you did a bad job. Maybe they're not ready to give right now. Maybe they're having a tough time economically. Maybe their charitable priorities have changed a little bit. And one of the most important things that people can learn in sales or any other realm, according to Seligman, is how to explain failure and rejection in a healthy way. And the way to do it is to say it's not personal, it's some other kind of force. It's not pervasive, it doesn't always happen, and it's not permanent, it's not going to ruin everything. When people explain failure as personal, permanent, and pervasive, as Seligman says, they're debilitated. They don't go into the next encounter with any effectiveness. But when people face rejection and they do what social psychologists call decatastrophize a situation, look for ways that it's not personal, look for ways that it's not pervasive, look for ways that it's not permanent, they end up being able to go into the next encounter and be more effective.
All right, let's take another situation where there is a personal element to it when you're trying. You mentioned this in the book because, we're all trying to sell things in our everyday lives. And as parents, we're trying to sell things to our kids. We're trying to promote certain values. We're trying to get them to do, whether, as you mentioned in your book, get your son to take a bath after he plays soccer. But there are also other issues, bigger issues as parents where we're trying to sell to our children. How does it work in that kind of a situation?
Well, I think one of the most important things to recognize in persuading, influencing, convincing others is that you're more likely to be effective if you can get people to consider and find their own reasons for doing something. So if when people have their own reasons for doing something, they're more likely to do it. And so when it comes to motivation writ large, we tend to think of motivation in slightly the wrong way, that motivation isn't something that one person does to another. It's something that people do for themselves. So changing the context and the environment in which people can summon their own reasons for doing something is often much more effective. This is actually something that there's some of the training of social work is in this realm. There's a technique called motivational interviewing, which I think some of your social worker listeners might be familiar with. I'll give you one specific. Let me just make it as concrete as possible.
Yeah, give us specific examples. Put a face on it, as social workers say, so we know what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Let's put a face on it.
Yeah.
Let's say you got a teenager, who has an incredibly messy room, and it's causing some problems because she can't find stuff. She's asking her parents to help her find stuff. She's losing homework, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so it's a problem with cleaning the room. So you could go to that kid and say, as a parent, you got to clean the room. You could demand it. Probably not going to work. You could try to threaten the person. Clean your room or else something bad will happen to you.
You're not going to the
bribe
dance.
The person.
Yeah.
Clean your room, okay? Those kinds of mechanisms, every once in a while it can be effective in the short term. They don't have much of a long-term effect. But a more effective approach, if you take a page from the world of motivational interviewing, there's a guy named Michael Pantalon at Yale who has a very interesting technique. So here's what he would do. Let's say you've got a kid named Maria, a 15-year-old named Maria whose room is kind of messy, and you want her to clean her room. One thing you could do is use this technique of motivational interviewing, and here's how it would work, a two-step process. First, okay, Maria, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 meaning not at all, 10 meaning absolutely ready, how ready are you to clean your room? Okay, and let's say that Maria answers, she's not very likely to do it. Let's say she's at 2 on a scale of 1 to 10. I'm a 2, Dad. Then the follow-up question is really important. Why didn't you pick Maria? Maria, why didn't you pick a lower number? Now, this is where it gets kind of weird, right? So what happens? Why isn't it a 1, Maria? Well, then, in that case, Maria says, well, because I know it'd probably be easier on me if I clean my room. I know that I wouldn't have to hassle you and Mom. I know that I'm 15. I should be able to find stuff on my own. And so by asking this question, Maria begins summoning her own reasons for cleaning her room. She begins surfacing her own autonomous motives for doing something. And that's really the key. Again, not that we do something to another person, but we try to change the context so they can come up with reasons for doing it on their own.
So you're putting, I don't like to use this word, the onus on them, so that they are presenting you and this 15-year-old Maria with the reasons why she should be cleaning her room.
Right, but they're also, the other thing that's important here is that they're Maria's reasons. It's not like Maria's necessarily adapting my reasons. Maria's coming up with reasons why her own reasons why it's a good idea. And when people come up with their own reasons for agreeing with you, they believe them more deeply, adhere to them more strongly.
So it's important, and you mentioned this in the book as well, it's important, whatever you're selling and to whomever you're selling, you asking questions is a good way, right? So you get the information
Absolutely.
rather than telling people what to do or trying to convince them. Which is what social workers do, which is what therapists do, which is what you've been talking about, which is really important. I'm thinking about parents. Boy, you have to really sit down and think about that in terms of how you're going to do the parenting. Do you have to be an intelligent parent? I'm thinking, because you really have to, in the midst of you want to scream at her, Maria, clean the room.
Totally.
And I used to use bribery, which did work, as you say, in the short term, not a good thing. But so you kind of have to really sit down and think about the way in which you're going to do that kind of parenting, don't you?
Sure, and you also have to look at things in any kind of encounter. Whether you're dealing with your spouse or your partner, whether you're dealing with your kids, whether you're dealing with people at work. What's really important is this principle of attunement. Can you see the world through their eyes? Can you understand their point of view? Once you understand their point of view and get stop being anchored in your own position, you're going to be much more effective in helping people find their own reasons for agreeing with you, if you understand someone else's perspective, and the social science gives us some really interesting ways to do that. If you understand someone else's perspective, you're more likely to reach common ground.
You would make a great couples therapist. This is what that's what it's all about.
Yeah, that's exactly what I need right now. It's hard enough being a writer, but there are these principles, as you say, Kathryn. They do apply. It's important to see things from other people's perspective. And I think what's interesting is that, let's take the parent-child relationship or the boss-employer relationship. One of the things that comes out very clear in the research on perspective taking is that the more power someone has or someone feels, the worse they are taking another's perspective. And so one of the things that you can do if you're a boss or in a position of nominal authority or a parent is go into an encounter and say, you know what, maybe I'm not the powerful one in this situation. Maybe I have less power than as a parent. And by looking for ways to consciously reduce how much power you feel, you actually become more acute at taking the other person's perspective, which paradoxically increases your power and effectiveness.
So how can we bring this into the realm of politics now? Let's get into another arena, gun control, for instance, because that's a hot topic. And you've got people, who obviously on both sides of the fence, and people who are really adamant and want to be in control and feel that what they, whether it's the NRA or President Obama, how would you use what you're talking about in that context?
Yeah, that's a hard one because you have, I'm not sure how much, and in politics right now is difficult. You can't apply all these principles because you have a systemic problem. So I'll give you an analogy. Let's say that you've got a used car and you're trying to sell the used car, and you want to sell the used car for $2,000 and you won't take any less. And I want to buy a used car, but I only have $500. We're not going to make a deal. And I think because there's no common ground, and I think that's one of the problems in politics right now is that it's become so polarized. There isn't any common ground, and so I think that the task of leadership in something like gun control is to see whether there is any common ground among people who say I've got a constitutional right to have firearms versus people who say firearms are inherently dangerous and we need to have some kind of regulation and some kind of control so we can reduce the grisly toll of deaths through guns here. I'm wondering whether there's some very interesting research on how actually changing how something is labeled can be really effective. So there's this great experiment involving something called the prisoner's dilemma, which is a common research technique. To make a long story short, it involves two people. If they cooperate with each other, they're both going to be better off. But if one cooperates and one doesn't, one's going to be better off, one's going to be worse off. And so the experimenters gave them this prisoner's dilemma, basically a game of whether you cooperate or whether you try to stick it to the other person. When they called this game the community game, more people cooperated. When they called it the Wall Street game, more people tried to stick it to each other, even though it was the exact same set of facts. And so I wonder whether there's a way to reframe this label and come up with something that is beyond gun control and Second Amendment. Because if somebody's frame is only Second Amendment, it's going to be hard to convince them that you need to have appropriate regulations. If someone's frame is only gun control, that's going to make the people who feel like they have a right a little bit leery. So I'm wondering whether there's a new frame, a new way to label this that can help people find that common ground.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think labels are really important. There are other examples of that. They couldn't, I think in the nursing profession, for instance, they want more men to be in the nursing profession, but calling them nurses has a connotation of, a woman in a little white cap and a little dress. And
Sure.
if you change it to physician's assistant, or you change it to flight attendant, for instance, if you want men to be flight attendants, you don't want to call them stewardesses. Yes, I agree with you. But getting back to your point, in politics, if we, find a common ground and maybe change the labels, we have a leader, President Obama. Is he someone who's able to maybe carry that off? Is he an ambivert, or is he, what is he?
That's a good question. I actually think the president is an ambivert. I think that he's much more, he's a guy, remember, he's written a couple of books. He's a writer. He was a law professor. He was a serious student. So he's probably more introverted than your typical politician, but he definitely has the skills of an extrovert. So my hunch is that he's very much, that he is in some ways a classic ambivert, that he has both the introvert skills and the extrovert skills in his repertoire. In terms of reaching common ground, I think it's really, really hard right now. Again, I think there's a systemic problem. If you look at the composition of the Congress, you have Democrats who are, in general, very far left, and Republicans who are, in general, extremely far right. And there's not a lot of overlap there in the middle. And until there is, I think it's going to be hard to fashion deals that are good for everybody. The sad part is that most people in this country are in that middle. So, I live here in Washington. I used to work in politics, and I'm not that optimistic about our ability to find that common ground anytime soon.
Yeah, well, it's too bad because obviously you're in D.C. and you also wrote for Al Gore, right? Is that true?
Right. In my misspent youth, I was a political speechwriter.
So you know what you're talking about when you're talking about politics.
I've seen it from inside the belly of the beast, and it's not pretty.
Well, that's not optimistic. How about, let's get into something that is positive, maybe, because this is in your book, and we only have a couple minutes left. And I just want you to talk about, because this is one of the chapters, the Twitter pitch. What is that?
Well, everything that we do, there are all kinds of ways that we pitch. So every tweet is a pitch. It's a plea for attention and engagement. Every email is a pitch. It's a plea for attention and engagement. And there's research showing that there are ways to do it more effectively. So, for instance, one of the most effective things to do in a tweet is to ask a question. Not to make a statement, but to ask a question. That leads to higher levels of engagement. Providing useful information to people in tweets turns out to be very effective. When it comes to email subject lines, there's very clear research out of Carnegie Mellon that says that the way to do an email subject line is to appeal either to utility, so make the subject line very clear, this is going to be useful to your work, or to appeal to curiosity, make people a little bit uncertain about it. And so President Obama, going back to him, sent out a gazillion emails in the campaign but the email subject line that got opened the most and that raised the most money was the sender from Barack Obama, the subject line, "Hey." That was it. And so very much a classic appeal to curiosity. So,
and I used to get one also that said, "Do you want to have dinner with the Obamas?" I think.
That's pretty good.
That was good. When I thought, well, maybe I do, and then
and so for your email subject lines, appeal to utility. So a subject line that says 3 answers to your question about new photocopiers, or appeal to curiosity. But don't do the stuff. A lot of us get caught in the middle, the mushy middle. So we have a subject line that says follow-up, a subject line that says question. And those murky in the middle, neither utility nor curiosity, don't do very well.
Well, it's a half an hour, and I assume you're going on to other radio shows. I could keep you on for another hour. This has been great. But so danpink.com is your website. I just want everybody to know that. And the name of the book is To Sell is Human, The Surprising Truth About Moving Others. It's been great having you on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. We're going to take a short break, and I'm Kathryn Zox, your social worker with the microphone, and you're listening to the Social Workers Radio Talk Show here at the University at Albany, WCDB FM. We'll be back in a minute.